Hi, and welcome to the mini lecture on Chapter 8. This mini lecture is going to be probably a little bit shorter than the other ones, mainly because it's dealing with complex designs, which sounds intimidating, but really we're going to be using a lot of the same tactics that we already talked about in the different methodologies, just there are going to be more of them. So you'll see, between and within subject designs, you'll see manipulation checks coming back up. Again, all things that have been discussed already in this class. It's just now we're going to be adding layers to them. So the first part of it is looking at multiple dependent variables. So again, dependent variables, it's what we're measuring. And most studies measure multiple dependent variables. So it's not a unique thing by any stretch of the imagination. The thing that I've highlighted on here as a technique is if you have multiple dependent variables, to try to keep them in the same order for all your participants and typically put the one that you're most interested up front. There is going to be concerns of carryover effects and practice effects, just like we talked about within subject designs, that if you've exposed them to the same thing time and time again, they're just going to get better at it. So it might not actually be anything that you're changing up from trial to trial. It's just this is their third time doing it. Same thing with answering a bunch of questions about whatever it is that you had them do. Their first few might be very honest, legitimate responses, but if you end up asking them 50, 60 questions, they might just be bored. They might not really fully read questions, things like that, that could have an impact. Alternatively, you could do a counterbalancing technique that if you have 10 different dependent variables that are equally important to you, then for one participant you order them a certain way. The next participant, maybe what was question 1 for the first participant is now question 10, and all your other questions got pushed up one spot. Next participant, you do the same thing, move what their first question was to 10 and push all of them up, so on and so forth. And so that's counterbalancing your dependent variables. Manipulation checks should be done just whenever we're using independent variables that are abstract. You should make sure that whatever you manipulated actually worked the way that you hoped it would. You can also look at doing different measures of the same dependent variable. So your textbook uses the example of stress, that you could define it different ways. So maybe you have a hormone cortisol test as well as a perceived stress scale, and you see, do they match up? And if they do, then great. We call that converging evidence that you participant scored the same on both. If they don't, then you have to figure out, do you keep that participant? Do you eliminate their data? Is there something flawed with the study? There's more investigation that has to be done. All right, so that was multiple dependent variables. Again, you're almost always going to have them. Multiple independent variables is a little bit more kind of, you decide it before you run the experiment because it's going to change up the kind of analyses that you do. Multiple dependent variables doesn't truly do that, but multiple independent variables, absolutely, it will. So essentially, your book talks about different scenarios of just having two things that you're interested in to see how does it impact a dependent variable. So effective age and divided attention on spontaneous recognition. So effective age being an independent variable in this case, divided attention being another independent variable, and then spontaneous recognition being your dependent your dependent variable. So we call these factorial designs, and it gets special names because when you have multiple independent variables, you do begin to talk about them slightly differently. You use slightly different terminology. So instead of saying one independent variable, we then call them factors. So we have one factor with this many levels and another factor with this many levels. So if you have this experiment of effective cell phone use and time of day on driving ability, we would have a 2 by 2 factorial design, because we have one factor of cell phone, second factor of time of day, and then the single dependent variable. So we have 2 levels of our first factor and 2 levels of our next factor. So that's where the 2 by 2 come into play. So you can see that they have wide ranging possibilities here. And depending upon how many factors you have and how many levels you have, it's going to exponentially increase or decrease the amount of conditions that you have. So a 2 by 2, which is this one up here, is going to have 4 different conditions, because you'll have the condition of using a cell phone in the daytime and driving. You'll have a condition of not using a cell phone in the daytime and driving, and then using a cell phone nighttime and driving, not using a cell phone nighttime and driving. So you get 4 at the end of it. You can have a 3 by 2, which means that you have 3 levels. So maybe instead of day versus night, you have morning versus afternoon versus night. So that gives you 3 conditions in here. This would ultimately yield 6 different conditions, because you're going to have cell phone use in the morning, cell phone use in the afternoon, cell phone use at night, and then no cell phone use in those 3 as well. You'd also have just massive designs. A 4 by 5 would have 20 different conditions, so on. So not only is this kind of the proper labeling for ANOVAs and different factorial designs, but it also is kind of the shortcut to figure out how many conditions are you actually going to end up with if you include every factor with every level that you're thinking of. You just do the quick math and it will yield how many conditions. So here, just kind of showing you a very common technique that's used for factorial designs is kind of making these type of squares to figure out how many conditions are you going to have, and then how many participants do you need per condition, and then you can get your total number of participants. Experiment could include something like type of psychotherapy, so cognitive versus behavioral, length of psychotherapy, 2 weeks versus 2 months, and the sex of the psychotherapist, female versus male. This would end up being a 2 by 2 by 2. So here we have 3 different factors: psychotherapy, length of it, as well as sex of who's doing it. But in each one of those, we have 2 different levels, right? So we have 2 levels here with cognitive behavioral, 2 levels of time length, and then 2 levels for sex. So in this case, it would be a 2 by 2 by 2, which gives you 8 conditions, right? Because you're going to have condition of cognitive psychotherapy at 2 weeks with a female, condition of cognitive psychotherapy at 2 weeks with a male, gives you 2, and then obviously you'd have it with cognitive 2 months, male, female, cognitive 2 months, male, female, gives you 4, and the same with behavioral, it's going to yield 4 more. So you get 8 in total. Or if you just do the math, again, you can do 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8. So again, it can grow very quickly, which means that you want to have very thought out factors that you are looking at, and very thought out levels of the factors as well. Because once you get into something like this down here, 2 by 2 by 2 by 3, it gets very overwhelming to try to analyze. We also have special things that we have to do when we get above 2 levels called post hoc analysis, and that is just kind of a nightmare to do if it's a 3 by 2 by 3 by 3. And there's so many conditions and so many moving parts in there that it is just painful. So we want to do our best to try to limit how many conditions in total we have. So this would be showing you the 2 by 2 by 2, right? So length here, psychotherapy type there, and then therapists in each one that you would select: male, female, male, or sorry, female down here, and then male here. Assigning participants, you're going to assign them the same way that you were assigning participants in the other stuff when it was a non-complex design. You're going to be using random assignment. You can choose if you're going to do it between subjects, meaning that participant only gets one condition, or if you're going to do it within subjects, meaning that participant is in every single one of them. And again, there's pros and cons to those that were talked about earlier. You can also have non-manipulated independent variables, also known as quasi-independent variables. So something like participant sex, participant age, those are things that obviously you cannot manipulate, but you can certainly look at them as, are they making differences? Here, the researchers use body consciousness, which they couldn't manipulate that at all. You come into the lab with your own level, but they can certainly measure it and then see low versus high, or however they decide to kind of categorize it. And then we get to some fancy graphs. So anytime that we do these type of studies, we have to figure out what's the best graphical representation to show our data. So you can do bar graphs or line graphs. Really, you can look to see what's going to be at your x-axis. If it's nominal data, then bar graphs work pretty well. If it's quantitative data, so interval or ratio levels, for sure, you're probably going to be using a line. All right, main effects and interactions. I don't want to go down the rabbit hole too much with this, but it is important to understand just for the right lingo. So a main effect is a statistical relationship between one independent variable and a dependent variable. So if you can remember from stats, like doing a t-test, if you find a significant difference between two things or two groups, that is pretty much what a main effect boils down to. Your independent variable did change or did cause a change in your dependent variable, and it is statistically significant. So we call that a main effect. We also have something called an interaction. So if you have multiple independent variables, let's just use two independent variables for the sake of ease, you're going to end up with two main effects as well as an interaction. You're going to have a main effect with how your first independent variable relates to whatever your dependent variable is. You're going to have a second main effect for your second independent variable and how that one relates to your dependent variable. And you're also going to get an interaction, which means as you take both those independent variables, are they having an impact on each other as it relates to the dependent variable? And again, we'll kind of highlight what that means in your textbook as a really good example here. But we call that an interaction when we see one independent variable depends on the level of another. So ultimately, your textbook uses this example of the effect of receiving psychotherapy is stronger among people who are highly motivated to change than among people who are not motivated to change. And it's probably not groundbreaking. It's something that you probably would guess, that if somebody is going through therapy and they actually want to be there and they're motivated to change something about themselves, that therapy is probably going to be viewed as more beneficial and it's going to have a better effect than somebody who is forced to go. So we have two independent variables, right? Going to therapy versus not going to therapy, and then motivation of change. Having high motivation to change versus little motivation to change. So we have, main effect of, is psychotherapy effective versus not going to psychotherapy, how effective is that? And then another main effect of, does wanting to change have a major effect versus not wanting to change? And then an interaction. How does going to psychotherapy and being highly motivated to change differ from going and not being motivated to change, and so on and so forth. So again, without trying to just bombard you with information, because interaction effects can get very complicated very quickly. Just going to try to leave it at that base level. And if you have questions about it, please do not hesitate to ask, because you will be dealing with main effects and interactions for your papers. In many studies, the primary research question is about an interaction. So lots of times, if you get an interaction, you don't really even care to report the main effects, because your question is typically about how do these two independent variables interact with one another or change one another, and how does that impact your dependent variable. So lots of times you will just report the interaction instead of all the main effects as well. Right. And then correlational. You can have complex correlational designs as well. And this happens if you only include non-manipulated independent variables, you're going to end up with correlational studies. Because again, if it's an experiment, it means that you had the ability to manipulate variables. With this, it's going to look just like any other correlation. You guys actually have already done a lab with this type of thing. So this table, while this particular one might not look extremely familiar, when you did the one about romantic partners and dating, I asked you to run a correlation on all the different variables. You got a table that looked like this. And so that is, looking at a factorial correlation. You have multiple variables that were measured, and now you're trying to see how do they relate to one another. See if there's anything. So with correlation, we can't say causation, right? That's the big thing. Correlation does not imply causation. When we have the factorial correlations or the complex correlations, we can do things to try to assist our understanding of that relationship. So your textbook uses the example of how likely people are to give. And so they're looking at socioeconomic status as a major part of why people are generous. And so they ultimately measure socioeconomic status. They put them in some type of scenario where they can measure their generosity. And they could look at that. Does socioeconomic status impact generosity? If they find the answer to be yes, that's great, but they run into all the things that correlations run into, all the different third variables. So you can then go and actually measure those as well. So, if they thought maybe people were being more generous because they're more religious, they can measure religiosity. Or maybe they thought people were being more generous because they're coming from different ethnic groups that emphasize generosity more so. So then they can measure ethnicity and plug that in. And if they're not finding correlations between generosity and religiosity or generosity and ethnicity, then they can kind of rule those out as possible third variables. With third variables, there are thousands, if not infinite amounts of possibilities that could be out there. So you're really just trying to limit the ones that you are aware of. But it does help to measure those. We can also do something called multiple regression, which is a statistical technique. Again, not going to dive too deeply into this, but the idea of it is that you have all of your independent variables, and it gives you an equation that lets you know how much impact does any one of those independent variables have on your dependent variable. And we know this because of something called a beta weight. So this is the very kind of computation or conceptual formula of multiple regression. So beta weight of independent variable 1, beta weight of independent variable 2, so on and so forth, gives you y y being your dependent variable. So if you end up with a very large beta weight here and a very small one, we would say, all right, independent variable 1 is more important to our dv than what independent variable 2 was. So again, just want to make you aware that there is that technique out there. But again, just for trying to make this as smooth as possible, we're not going to dive any deeper into multiple regression. And so that ends the mini lecture. Like I said, it's going to be shorter because a lot of what's in the book is review. It's just taking it up into kind of the complex design, which again sounds scary, but in practice, just slow down, take your time, and just recognize that it's very similar to just doing a single independent variable, single dependent variable study. It's just now kind of at a bigger level. So if you have any questions about the material in the book or anything that I said, please do not hesitate to contact me.